listening to Trending with Timmerie, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics. National speaker Timmerie Millington has been a passionate advocate for life as long as she can remember, helping Gen X through Z answer the call to true feminism and authentic manhood. Timmerie holds a master's degree in biblical theology, and she covers this week's hottest stories from a Catholic worldview. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Hey everyone, Timmerie here. Father Tim Grumbach is in studio with me, and we have a full show. I was talking to Father Tim before the show, and for those who don't know, Father Tim is from St. Augustine Parish in Los Angeles. You're here so regularly that I feel like I don't have to introduce you anymore, but I should.
It's always fun to be introduced by somebody, though.
Yes, yeah. It is. And you have to know a little bit about your background. He's heading out to Texas, by the way, so any of our Texan listeners, he'll be at the Life Teen Camp with your teenagers. So be sure to come and say hello to him.
Yeah, we won't be too far outside of San Antonio, and I'm really looking forward to it. I've never been to that part of Texas, and so God's going to be doing a lot over the next week, so please pray for us. Awesome.
I know you're in Ventura County, or not in Ventura County, Whittier tonight. I'm thinking about all these earthquakes and the different places it's hit. We've been shaking and quaking here in California, if you haven't known. My husband's not from California, and the earthquakes have been a little bit of a surprise to him.
Yeah, and I was just sharing with you, there was something really cool that happened during that's 7.1, I think it was, yes. 6.9, 7.1. Either way, it's a big earthquake. I was celebrating Mass that night, and so it was Friday night. And we were having our first Friday Mass, and so this big emphasis on the Eucharist and the Sacred Heart of Jesus. And literally, as I'm lifting up the Eucharist and the doxology, I hear everything begin to shake and move. I'm like, what's going on here? And all the light fixtures start moving. The people pointing at the cross, which is swinging in the sanctuary behind me. I'm like, yeah, this is the moment when the earth should be shaking during every single Mass. But thankfully, we don't need this reminder at every single Mass. And so, so we could be grateful that it was everyone was safe in our church. But we're praying for those in Ridgecrest who suffered a lot and are still suffering because of the devastation of those quakes.
Absolutely, and what a great spiritual gift that God allowed that timing.
Yeah, right.
During the Mass.
Well, now every Mass that I celebrate, I'm like, is it going to happen again? Is it going to happen again? So,
Lord, you can quake and shake, but please don't let the walls fall down.
Right, yeah.
Not during Mass. Well, we have a lot to talk about today. A bit of the theme is really using your voice to speak up. A lot of these issues are tough issues, especially with what's going on worldwide with regard to human life, defending and protecting it, both in the early stages from abortion and the later years away from essentially physician-assisted suicide and outright killing through euthanasia. We have some really chilling stories coming up from the UK about forced abortion and euthanasia. For those who don't know, we'll break that down a little bit, but also looking into some of the good news and change in pro-life perspective. And also don't go away, because we'll be talking about the issue of rejection and how men really struggle with rejection and what can be done to really change the mindset and to move forward to take action in your lives.
Yeah, because there's so much happening in the world right now. There's so much to say about it, and we might be afraid to be rejected because of what we have to say about it as faithful Catholics, trying to be faithful Catholics. But there's so much. So we'll go ahead and look at some of these things and just kind of preach God's mercy into the beginning of life, the end of life, and everything in between.
So one issue that we don't talk enough about is that our death is inevitable. However, how we die should be a serious topic of concern. In fact, recently in the United Kingdom, there's a disabled man who, as he is no longer receiving medical attention apart from nutrition, artificial nutrition through feeding tubes, basically a machine is helping to feed him. Well, this man has been ordered through the courts now that he is to be euthanized. Essentially, the basic nutrition of food and water is being taken away from him so that he will die as a result.
This is even a little bit more gruesome than euthanasia in itself, euthanasia being the actual ending of one's life. This is looking at a person who, well, for one, is not contributing anything to society. That may be one gruesome way to look at it. And another is someone who's suffering isn't contributing to the society. So let's end this person's suffering. And instead of just killing him, which some would call a mercy killing, they are actually taking away his food and his hydration, and so he will starve and die of thirst because he's somebody who's experienced a traumatic accident some years ago. 10 years ago, and so he's been a quadriplegic all this whole time. I don't believe he's been speaking, but he's been able to see people and
emotionally interact with them.
Right, and it's such a complicated and difficult situation for the family because I think 6 of 8 of his siblings want them to end his life, and his wife as well. And we must take into consideration the suffering that they see in him and the suffering that they're enduring, having to watch this as well. But his parents do not want this to happen. But the courts have ordered this to happen and are forcing the hospital in which he's staying to take away his food and his hydration. And this is a real tragedy. And the Catholic Church has spoken to this. The CDF.
For months now. Yeah.
Well, that and the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith has some official teaching from as far back, I believe, as 2007, speaking to a situation like this, in which a person seems to be in some sort of vegetative state, which he isn't even necessarily in a vegetative state, but somebody who cannot care for themselves, who, if they're not keeping him alive by extraordinary means, they are simply feeding him and giving him hydration. And because he's become such a burden to the society, it's very difficult for his family.
It's in many ways very similar to the Terry Schiavo situation, where ultimately some family members were for ending the life and other family members were for preserving the life. And here's a reality. You may be listening and you may have the utmost compassion. Wow, this man, Vincent Lambert, for 10 years has really been in this disabled state. However, we can't say that quality of life determines whether or not someone should live or die. That's the same argument people make for children and aborting them. And so the church very clearly comes in and talks about how essentially we have to look at basic means of care. And there's a difference between ordinary basic care and extraordinary care. And the church classifies that ordinary care includes basic hydration and nutrition through food, even if that requires some sort of machine in order to give that nutrition. And so the Catholic Church lays out in its bioethics conversation really clear examples. There's a difference between, let's say, someone dying as a cause of a disease or a cancer and someone intentionally being starved to death. In this case, this man's only cause of death will be starvation, not a disease that has taken over his body.
Right. And that's what the church has been speaking to, and in specific ways over the last 12 years. And so this is nothing new for the church to encounter and to speak God's mercy into. And ultimately it comes down to, when did this person lose their dignity so that we will let them starve to death?
Well, and it's also a testament to the issue of marriage as well. Right. My heart feels, for this woman who probably, it doesn't say if they have children or anything like that, but I imagine this woman's challenge, and her husband is severely wounded and will be likely for the rest of their marriage. Yet what are those vows that we say? To death do us part, in sickness and in health. And to see the challenges that we will not know that come up, but this is what God is calling us to in order to sanctify us in the loving sacrifice that we make.
Right. And this isn't a matter of us saying, this woman must make this decision, that we're not trying to force her to make this decision because of, how terrible this must be for her family. And it must not have been an easy decision for her.
But you have to remember, decisions like this were not even allowed until more recently. In fact, France has so that it is illegal for a euthanasia to be initiated in the country. However, in 2005, suddenly a law was passed for the first time there, allowing that if there seems to be, quote, disproportionate treatment, which no longer affects the maintaining of life, then essentially that disproportionate treatment doesn't need to continue to be used. But disproportionate treatment is not basic food and water. It will be one thing if it's a machine forcing the person to breathe, but basic nutrition is something different. And again, there's a difference between a disease taking over the body and nutrition being removed and taking over the body.
Yeah. And another lesson for this that comes from this situation is that a lot of this has not been put into writing in a legal sense.
Right.
And it's really important for us as Catholics to understand this as well, is advance directives are really important for our medical situations, because we never know when an accident like this may even happen to us. And to protect our dignity as a human person and that of our family members is to, yes, be prepared for situations like this, because the medical community is not always on board with what the church has to teach about end-of-life issues.
And many of our state laws are changing very quickly right now with regard to physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. And so, in fact, the church, here's a great example of a resource for you. It's the ncbcenter.org. That's the National Catholic Bioethics Center. And they will actually help you and even give you consultation how to create these advanced directives. But here's something that's really important. Advanced directives are not enough. Because what if, and we've seen this across the nation, especially with people, good Catholic families, where in the advanced directives it says one thing, yet the situation is a little different than what's in the advanced directive. So ultimately, what the church advises is that you both have advanced directives for end-of-life care, but also that you have someone who will respect and understand the church's teaching, who will be your power of attorney in those situations. So in fact, for those, who are maybe wanting to know, we never know when a crisis will hit. Yesterday, I sent an email to my husband saying, hey, I want to make sure that you know the church's teaching on end-of-life issues and really understand it, because it can be complicated issues. And here are resources, the NCB Center, God forbid anything happens to me, but also family members, how we help navigate those issues in the future as well.
Yeah, it was a really important thing as we were going through the end of our time at seminary as well, as priests, entering into a different kind of life of relationships than most people enter into family life, that we have these advanced directives in place, that our families understand what our wishes are, that we have our wills and our in place in case some tragedy like this should happen, that we don't end up having our human dignity taken away from us at the end of life situations. And what it comes down to, yes, is that being created in the image and likeness of God cannot take that human dignity away from a person who needs to be defended, who needs to be cared for when they cannot care for themselves. A situation like this can lead to great sanctity in the family. It can make a saint out of a person who suffers in this way. And who are we to take that away from them? As cruel as that might sound, as if we're forcing a cross onto somebody's shoulders. But how are we also going to walk with them and help them see this as a cross rather than as a ball and chain that is just holding them down?
And there's often peace that people need to make with God at the end of their lives, whether one part is having, anointing the sick, receiving reconciliation, but also the peace and reconciliation with God and with people who come around them. I look back to Evangelium Vitae, St. Pope John Paul the Great's message on human life. Evangelium Vitae means human life, right? And he talks about euthanasia and the real concern, not only through the direct action of euthanasia, but by also the omission, sins of omission. We don't think about that very often, where we omit speaking up or omit certain treatments, such as food and water, that is basic treatment. And he talks about there's a difference between bringing about death and the purpose for eliminating some pain. Ultimately, pain cannot be a reason for killing someone. That's not a dignified death, as hard as they try to call it that right now.
Yeah, and it goes back to over the last, I believe, 5 years or so since we had that case where that woman wanted to go up to Oregon for an assisted physician-assisted suicide. And some really powerful and heartbreaking letters being written by those who are suffering, in their own ways, but choosing to enter into that suffering as an experience of the cross and as a part of their sanctification, saying, your suffering is not meaningless. Is that I don't know what the meaning of it is, only God does. But to throw it away, St. John Paul II, who wrote Evangelium Vitae, and who saw the worst that humanity had to offer through the Nazi concentration camps that many of his friends were sent to through the communist rule in Europe while he was Pope, that he saw the worst that humanity had to offer, but he still fought for the dignity and the dignity of the human person. He could have said God,
freedom. Right.
He could have said God does not care about us if he even exists. That's the kind of world that he grew up in. But his whole life, not just his pontificate, but his whole priesthood was centered around, human love and its ability to not just imitate but participate in the love of the Holy Trinity. And he says this is where the dignity of the human person comes from. And when you try to take the dignity of the human person away, when you try and take God away, humanity loses itself, and you cannot take God away from humanity. And so he would also just be writing about the great freedom, the great dignity of the human person, and especially end-of-life issues. And then he gave us his own example of his own death, his own dying in front of the world to say this is the dignity that a human person can have at the moment of their suffering and their death.
I think of Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati and his statement of "to the heights," right?
Yes, verso alto.
Yes, to the heights. Let's go beyond what is comfortable. Let's go to the top of that mountain. Let's go. All of God's covenants that He makes with His chosen people are on mountains. God is calling us closer to Him, and if He's calling us closer to Him, that's ingrained in our bodies. And have we forgotten? And I've not heard this said before, that God created us to experience pain. That is a part of how we were created. If God allowed us to be created in such a way, there is something so profoundly human about the pain that we experience.
And it's also been profoundly suggested that God created us in His image so that eventually He could become one of us and unite us to Himself. And, we know that pain is a part of that experience. And, it's, theologically much debated whether or not Adam and Eve would have experienced pain of any sort. I'm probably more of the type that would believe that they would have experienced pain of some sort. But their relationship with pain would have been far different than what we experience. But through our redemption in Christ, we have the opportunity to offer our pains up in union with the cross so that it actually becomes transformative, not just for us, but for the world. And so that our pain and our suffering is not meaningless. And the world tries to tell us it's meaningless, and that because there's pain and there's suffering, that God must not exist. If a truly loving God existed, how could there be pain and suffering? And we get to point to the cross and say, well, that's why. And that's not just something that happened. God wasn't just like, I want to go spend time with my creation, so I'm going to enter, I'm just going to experience what they experience. Well, yeah, that was the beginning of it, but He also wants to transform it, and still does every day, even the tiniest sufferings and the greatest sufferings, united to the cross, a language that's not used enough in the church. Unite your sufferings to the cross. JP2 would say to his friends who were suffering, don't waste your suffering. Pray for me, pray for the church, pray, we're praying for you, but more important are your prayers for us. Don't waste your suffering.
That's Father Tim Grumbach. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. This topic of euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, this is a battle that will only increase with time, because people believe that it is merciful and dignified to allow that death to happen on my own terms, through my choice, through alleviation of suffering. But this is a distinctly Christian message that we have to offer to the world, in a world that is hurting so badly, physically, emotionally, psychologically. That union, that value of suffering is something that you and I need to learn to talk about. And I think of this, Father Tim and I mentioned at the beginning of the show that this is about speaking up. We have to remember that Jesus has said over and over again, I look at the Gospel of John, chapter 15, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. And I think that turning back to reading a reflection on the Sermon on the Mount, going back to the Beatitudes, rejoice and be glad, the kingdom of heaven is yours. That's what he says right after talking about the persecution we will experience and the rejection that even the prophets before him experienced.
Yeah, your reward will be great in heaven. And the rest of the world will say, well, why do I have to wait till then? Why not now? But I truly believe that God is breaking into the world now, and he doesn't want us to wait until heaven to experience that kind of love, to begin to experience that kind of love. And that's why we have the sacraments. The sacraments are God pouring his grace into the world. As the Catechism says of the sacraments, that those, that's the way that the head brings life to the body. Yeah. These aren't just rites of passage. These aren't just initiation rituals. This is the way that the head gets life into the body.
Well, and have we thought about this? Jesus preaches the kingdom of heaven is now. Mm-hmm. It's at hand. Yeah. That person who's suffering could be a living day saint, and we not know it, or we could be preventing that sanctification from taking place.
Yeah, and we might be seeing it in those who are suffering the most, in maybe Vincent Lambert, maybe the children whose lives are being taken in the wombs. God, I've never been more convinced of anything in my life than this, that God has already placed the saints that we need where they need to be. Let's wait. Let's see what these saints are about to do. It might be you, it might be me, but God is not surprised by what's happening in our culture right now. He has his saints in place. And if we're entering into this dire complaining all the time, that we utterly distrust the leaders of the church, we may not believe it, we may not say it, but we might live as if the church is collapsing around us. Do we not believe that God has put the saints that are needed where they need to be right now, and we're waiting for them to rise up?
In our own lives, even. Yeah. In our own lives, where we're being called out. And that may be you that needs to call out other people. We were talking earlier on the phone about how hard it is for you in some of the counsel with even just, for example, soon-to-be married couples. Right. And the situation and the sin that's being lived in, and how to prudentially call them out of that at the same time as helping them to understand, well, you also have to trust me and know that I love you as well.
Right. Yeah. And you don't get to start marriage prep with the first question is, are you living together? Okay, well, you don't get to do that anymore, or I'm not going to prepare you for marriage. Yeah. Maybe some priests do that. Yeah. It wasn't the way that I was taught, and I don't think it would work with the people that I'm walking with. And so, maybe it's a buzzword. Accompaniment right now is a bit of a buzzword, but it is a tool. Yeah. It is not an end. Right. It is a tool that must be used from time to time.
And, I keep thinking about, I just came off of Vox Vitae. We had 120 teenagers there wanting to learn about their Catholic faith, about abortion, about chastity, how to sidewalk counsel, all of these issues. And they kept coming up to me with questions, because we talk a lot about transgenderism. Does God make someone gay? These are all issues we discuss. And a lot of their questions had to do with same-sex attraction and how to talk to someone who's living, a contraceptive lifestyle, who's having sex outside of marriage, who's engaging in same-sex sexual activity. And he said, what do I say? And I say, I turn back to when I'd be in front of the abortion clinic, or whenever I'm talking to an abortion-minded woman. And you have to first ask the Holy Spirit to be with you. And I take this to every conversation I have now, where someone's sharing a very private moment with me, or a lot of sin, or a difficult situation. I go, good Lord, I am praying through it. I do not know how to respond right now. And I can tell you, when you are willing to turn to the Holy Spirit, but then to stand up and speak up to that person, and also learn when to shut up as well. The Lord may call you to something very bold at that time, or he may call you to a very gentle and slow movement of speech that you share with that individual.
Or we can take the words, all of that, yes. And we can take the words of Christ when some of the first disciples met him, and he said, what are you looking for? And it was such a beautiful moment that, that the Lord is always asking that to us. What are you looking for? And we can lead that conversation that way. So, okay, your experience of same-sex attraction, what are you looking for? Like at the depths, have you asked yourself? Have you given God permission to tell you what it is that you're looking for?
Or I think of the words of Michael Gasparo a couple weeks ago, when he shared that when he's counseling someone who's got a porn addiction. Well, take yourself to that moment when you were looking at that porn video. What was in your eyes? What were you looking for? It might be the intimacy of a spouse. It might be friendship. It might be strength. There are different things. We're searching for something that's leading us at times into the wrong path as the answer. And so this is about freedom. Our last episode, we talked about freedom. So Father Tim and I just want to challenge you, speak up, see the value of suffering and see the joy in the Christian lifestyle.
Timmerie will be right back. Send her a tweet at Timmerie. That's TIMMERIE. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie, where morality and culture meet, offering an eternal perspective on today's hottest topics.
It's great to be back with all of you. A bit of a heavy show. We've been talking about euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, pain and suffering. There's a reason that we're bringing up these issues. Father Tim Grumbach of St. Augustine Parish in Los Angeles Diocese is with me. And Father, you have been accompanying people, and I just complained about that word, but I used it, at their deathbed now, through the marriage preparation process, through the grieving process. And so that's why we're diving deep into this issue, because where suffering is, where conversion is, the church is there. And there's another topic that I'd like to briefly touch on before we jump into some concerns about minors in the law right now. And that is in the United Kingdom, yet another thing taking place under their court system. A court made the decision to force a disabled woman to have an abortion. She's in her early 20s. Not a lot of personal information has been shared with her, but this 20-year-old young girl does not want to have the abortion, nor does her mother want her to have it, nor does her social worker approve the issue. Yet the court ordered that she have this abortion, a late-term abortion as well. And yet finally, after appeals to many different courts, another court ended up ruling that this should not occur. The question, however, is how many women in the UK are being forced to have an abortion?
In the language of in the best interests of the women. In this case, is a woman in her mid-20s who has, I believe, some mental disability. And so, the courts are looking at her and say, oh, there's no way that she would be able to take care of this child. Her own mother has said, I will take care of the child.
And her social worker, third party, right? Disinterested in a sense.
Yeah. And there was I don't know how official the news was, but there was a grotesque mention that the doctor said, oh, we'll give you a new doll and you can take care of the doll and we'll take care of the child. And yeah.
And they forget all the psychological studies behind the damage to the woman who has an abortion.
Right.
Why would you further expose her to that trauma?
Forget or never acknowledged in the first place.
Well, what's interesting behind this at the same time, the original person who was a Justice Nathalie Levin, who actually decided that she would have this abortion, a late-term abortion. This Justice Levin actually was a major advocate in the past for British Pregnancy Advisory Services, which is in fact essentially the largest abortion provider in the UK. So this woman has a favoritism toward abortion advocacy, essentially.
And what was even more terrifying about her decision was that she herself admitted to being aware that this was a dangerous case, that such government intrusion into such a personal matter, as they would prefer to use this language, such a private matter, was an intense intrusion by the state, but was still willing to go through it because this was how she understood the best interests of this young woman, which is a terrifying thing to hear the government or a representative of the government saying, yes, I'm exerting too much power, but I'm going to do it anyway.
This is a scary situation that the United States may find itself in soon as well, because in the UK, over the last few years, we've seen multiple babies who have been essentially killed in rejected treatment as a result of court decisions removing rights from parents. We were just talking earlier about the gentleman who is going to be euthanized by the courts. This is a really scary situation. In fact, the gentleman earlier we mentioned that may be euthanized after a court order, the parents appealed to the UN, and the UN health, one of the health departments for the UN ended up saying, hey, can you wait so that we can investigate this case? And in fact, the courts in the UK refused to, which shows some red flags about the way the court systems are handling issues of human life. It's not just there in the UK that we have some serious cause for concern. Very briefly, Father and Tim and I are calling you to speak up. Ohio heartbeat law is being overturned for the state of Ohio by one court judge. We'll see where this battle takes. It could go to the Supreme Court potentially. The conversation, essentially why it was overturned or blocked from being implemented in Ohio, is because it creates an undue burden or a quote insurmountable barrier to abortion, which is because of a 1992 Supreme Court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which said that no abortion restriction could be implemented that caused an undue burden on a woman to have an abortion.
Right, and the situation coming up in Ohio right now is because the previous governor refused to sign something like this into law because he was afraid of how much it would cost the state in legal bills and finances as pro-abortion groups would fight the law. And so instead of standing up for life, for the sake of standing up for life, he seemed to set it aside for the sake of the finances of the state. And so this new governor very boldly signs this into law, and then the judge comes in and says, well, as many judges who are striking these laws down say, well, one, they're on, they're not going to be constitutional and whatnot. But
this is a case we could see go somewhere to the Supreme Court. We don't know what case essentially will end up going there, but here's the deal. Whatever pro-life law or whatever pro-abortion law it is, we need to speak up for life, and we need to have the numbers and the voices behind it along with the financial backing, because states like Ohio and other states that are passing pro-life laws are going to take on the financial responsibility for defending this law against radically pro-abortion ideologies that are seeking to strike them down. So we're calling you to speak up. Be aware right now. Great news. Gallup poll shows that pro-life position is up. We're up to 49% and pro-choice is down to 46%. That's the most pro-life we've seen since polling back in 2013, essentially, which shows ultimately this attribution is not attributed to pro-life laws so much that were passed, but more so to the radically pro-abortion laws of places like Vermont, Illinois, and New York. So this radical ideology, if you speak about it, hearts and minds are changing.
And the way the media is, much of the media is presenting it from a pro-choice perspective. I think our younger generation is getting fed up with that. We're able to look at the science. A lot of younger hearts are saying there's got to be more than what this world can give to us. So there must be something in my faith that tells me to speak out against this. And so our younger generations are growing up as pro-life generations. And so, okay, maybe it's not happening as quickly as we would like for it to. But again, this will all make sense as we prepare our hearts to say, look, God is putting the saints where they need to be to prepare to turn the world upside down from this bizarro world that we have, where ignoring science, trying to create faith as something as simply private and shouldn't have anything in the public sphere. So the pro-life generation is out there.
My challenge to everyone listening, though, is that while the pro-life generation continues to grow, the problem is this generation is also very relativistic. So although they hold to a pro-life situation, in a difficult situation, they're being very permissive about abortion. And so this is where stronger morality, the reason why, the harm on the woman, the humanity, the personhood of the baby, these are such important daily conversations to be had.
Yeah, in this younger generation, facing the temptation of this relativism and having a difficult understanding that about objective truth, and being told over and over again that speak your truth, even that subtle language that, okay, I have a truth that's different from other people's truth. And so that there's no such thing as objective truth. I've got to say, I went to see the new Spider-Man movie. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil anything. But the MJ is Peter Parker's girlfriend, and she has to come to his defense at one time, protecting his identity as Spider-Man. Don't worry, that's not a spoiler. You know that Peter Parker is Spider-Man, okay? Well, she's accusing another character of making something up, and she actually quotes Orwell that the very concept of objective truth is fading out of the world. And she uses this almost as this relativistic, you can speak your truth, but whatever sort of moment, when, really what was actually really behind that quote was Orwell looking at the Spanish Civil War and the kind of reporting that was coming out of it, and says, no one believes in objective truth. And this is terrifying. And, but now a younger generation can hear a quote like objective truth is fading out of the world and say, yeah, that's right. That's the way it should be. And so, it's kind of let me down to see that character like MJ in Spider-Man is probably part of a pro-choice culture and generation, willing to be so relativistic, but that our younger generation, there are young men and women who want to be pro-life and want to understand that there's an objective truth, but they're being bombarded, even in the most popular of culture, with this sense that objective truth is fading out from the world, and good riddance, when that was never the original intent of George Orwell in that quote. But here we are.
Here we are.
Yeah.
It makes me think of the little kids. When we talk about relativism, and I think of little kids. My brother, for example, used to love dressing up as Spider-Man. And remember, sometimes it was a battle for my parents to get him to change out of the Spider-Man, the Batman, the Indiana Jones costume, leave the whip at home, whatever it might have been. And I remember one day it was a battle, and we got him to go to church wearing normal clothes. And it happened to be that he was asked to bring the gifts up at Mass. And he was a little guy, adorable. And he goes up and he walks up to give the gifts, and the priest leans down and just thinks my brother's adorable. And he goes, "Oh, what's your name, young man?" And he goes, "Peter Parker."
Nice.
He was still in the costume, but that was just a fun story. But what it made me think of, we're talking about Spider-Man and moral relativism. At a certain point, you've got to tell your kid you're not actually Spider-Man. For as devastating as that is, you're not Indiana Jones. Ideally, as they get older, sadly, they start to leave those costumes behind. And, you think of memories as just a part of, at least for me as an older sister, the sadness of them growing up and the sweetness. But at the same time, real maturity starts to see things for what they really are, and we discover truth. Yet we were talking earlier about perpetual adolescence in a past show. We're allowing people to live in perpetual adolescence in fantasy worlds. And
how else are we going to discover the saint that God has created us to be than to set aside those fantasies about who we want to be and to find the true desires that God has put onto our hearts, that He is the one that has put them there.
Amen. We'll be right back on Trending. We'll be talking about men and rejection and how to better deal with the issue of rejection. We'll be right back with Father Tim Grumbach.
You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie.
Okay, rejection is an issue that many people face, and some handle it better than others. Yet, I was inspired recently, Father Tim, by this article that came out from Catholic Match Institute, actually, where it was talking about men, are you scared of rejection? Which inspired me to a deeper conversation overall about the topic of rejection for men. This is written by David Brettenbeck. Excellent article. I'll go ahead and tweet it out. But Father Tim, I would love to hear your thoughts on the whole issue of rejection, dating rejection, but job rejection, whatever it might be for men.
Right. Who is our primary example as men? Well, it's got to be Jesus Christ as Catholics, as Christians. What did Jesus have to say about rejection? Well, you will be rejected, but that God will be doing more in our rejection than He can in our success and our popularity, our fame, and our wealth. And I think that's where it has to begin. Then we can get into the psychological issue of what rejection does to us. But before anything else, let's look at the reality of a God who entered into rejection for the sake of bringing us back to Himself.
It made me think of my professor, Dr. Michael Barber, in grad school, would always say, the only election, the only competition Jesus Christ ever was in was that against Barabbas when the Jews were deciding whether or not to release Jesus or Barabbas, and He lost.
Right. And how awesome is Barabbas's name to begin with? What does Barabbas mean? Barabbas, it means son of the Father. And what does Matthew's gospel tell us about Barabbas's first name? Yeshua. They chose the wrong Jesus, son of the Father. They chose the one that they thought could get them immediately what they wanted, rather than the one who was really challenging them to more.
And what's interesting for those who don't know the context, Barabbas was actually like a political revolutionary at the time. And so they wanted him because they thought he was going to liberate them. He was a false Messiah to them.
Right. And so as Christians, conforming ourselves to Christ, people are going to choose perhaps what's most immediately satisfying to them, and we have to be okay with that. And so as men, we stand there with Christ, of whom Pontius Pilate said, ecce homo, behold the man. And so if we're going to understand ourselves as men who experience rejection, the first image that we should be looking at is that of Christ wearing the royal gowns with the crown of thorns on his head, having been flogged halfway to death. Yeah. And so if we want to understand rejection, before we look at the psychological impact it has, let's understand that we are called to it. Just recently, the gospel reading for Sunday was Jesus sending the 72 out to prepare the way for him. And he didn't say, if they don't accept you. He said, when they don't accept you, I am sending you like a lamb among wolves.
And at times he says, dust off your hands, move on. Don't necessarily throw your pearls before swine. Like, you can try. That's why, in the article it talks about, and I think it's not just dating, but it's that job, Matthew in the article says, oh, well, what if, people will just say, well, at least you asked that girl out. And, before you asked her out, you didn't have a date. And after you asked her out, you didn't have a date. But he's going, no, that pain and rejection actually hurts. Same thing with putting yourself on the line to interview or apply for a new job. And that rejection sucks. And that's just a part of life, though. If we don't put ourselves out there, we will actually never learn to love or to grow, because the reality is even loving is opening your heart up to pain and rejection as well. So what do? Do we close it in and put it really tight inside our bodies and never love? No, C.S. Lewis talks about how men need to have hearts. And it's by having a heart, leaving your soul vulnerable, that you become the man you're called to be. Right.
C.S. Lewis wrote that to love at all is to be vulnerable. And that we could keep ourselves safe from the vulnerability of love by wrapping our hearts up in hobbies and little luxuries. And I love it. He says the casket of your own selfishness. But in that casket, right. Wow. Yeah. He says in that casket, it will be, airless and safe and protected, but it will change.
It's dead.
Yeah, right. It will change. Your heart will become impenetrable. It will become stronger in a way, but it will become irredeemable. And that the only way to be safe from the risk of tragedy, from the vulnerabilities of love, is to break our hearts out of that casket of our own selfishness. And he says the only place that your heart is safe from the perturbations of love, other than heaven itself, is hell. And that's the casket of our own selfishness. And so perhaps we avoid rejection because we're selfish, because we don't want to enter into what Jesus has already promised to us, that a part of the Christian life is rejection. Just look at the cross. If we're serious about being Christians, we're serious about conforming our lives to Christ, we're going to be serious about conforming our lives to the cross, not as a ball and chain, but as something that actually brings life. And so, this article has I love the resolution of it, is that embrace who you are. I mean, we can say so much more than embrace who you are. Embrace who you are as conformed to the image of Christ. Right. You're not defined by your sins, your weaknesses, your failures, your faults. Don't embrace that part of who you are. Yeah.
You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. That's Father Tim Grumbach. I love where you're talking about embrace who you are. And I misspoke earlier. I didn't send Michael. It's David Brettenbach. He says achieve. And he keeps throwing the word out there like men, achieve. That's what it is to be masculine. He said, I don't care about sex stereotypes. I hate saying gender stereotypes. Like, just achieve. That's what you're called to. And I think, in a sense, about the monastic lifestyle and how for centuries, when they pray the divine office, the liturgy of the hours back and forth, there was this chanting back and forth. They would pray in like a C shape, a half circle, and they would chant back and forth to each other. And the monks viewed it as a battle cry, calling each other out, challenging each other to live their identity in Christ, to be soldiers for the gospel, to find their strength in God. Men, with that comes rejection. With that actually comes death. We read at St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 5, husbands, he could even say men, lay down your lives as Christ did for the church.
Right, in order to nourish and to cleanse her, in order to present her spotless and without blemish to himself. And what a beautiful image it is, that mutual submission, right? That wives are called to be submissive to their husbands as the head of the family, as Christ was head of the church, and that it's not about domination by any means. It was never meant to be. A man's domination over his wife is actually a result of the original sin, but that Christ is able to take that headship to recreate it, redeem it, and create it into something that will experience rejection, but in doing so will be a matter of nourishing and bringing life to his bride. And so all men are called to a certain amount of rejection, but that to be afraid of that rejection is a bit of a selfishness.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I love where you mentioned you not only lay down your life for your bride as Christ did for the church, but you said so that the church, the bride, can be spotless. You take on that rejection as a man so that there can still be that purity in the world, in the church, in your relationship. That rejection of, no, you can't have sex outside of marriage. That rejection of difficult situations, standing up for your faith. It's okay to take a little egg on your face for the sake of who you are as a son of God. Yeah,
and I think the Christian life requires us to learn how to fall, right? In many ways. I've learned this lesson in many other ways outside of the Christian context. As a surfer, you have to learn how to fall. Otherwise, you're going to lose your breath and you're not going to be able to get back to your board. As a cyclist, I have to learn how to fall. Otherwise, I'm going to break a bone every time I hit the deck. In my hobbies, I've had to learn how to fall. How's that different in the spiritual life? It's not saying that sin is good. It's not saying that falling is good. But if I don't know how to fall in order to let the Lord lift me back up, then I don't know how to experience rejection, and I don't know how to get back up. And so it's a deep and profound truth of the spiritual life is that we have to experience a rejection, not a rejection from God, but a rejection from the world. That's all over St. John's writings, is that of Jesus saying that if the world hated me, it will hate you. That love of the world is not love of God.
And it reminds us to pray for the virtue, especially as men, for the virtue of valor, to that courage, right? To act in the face of fear, to truly act in the face of that fear, of rejection, of humility, whatever that might be, to choose to still act, to take action.
Well, one of the strangest things for me to be looking at in our Catholic culture right now is I guess awards ceremonies, people being given honors and even like honorary doctorates and things like this, and
honorary award for this, honorary award for that. They make Catholic events horrible.
I love that we're able to show our appreciation for what people are doing and the sacrifices they make and the generosity that they're able to show that God has placed onto their hearts. But it's just so strange to me that we accept honors in the same way that the rest of the world accept honors. And I know there will be days when people want to give me stuff like that. I want to avoid it, but there will be those days. And I don't know. Maybe I'll just have to uncomfortably receive it.
It's an act of humility.
Right. Yeah. And so maybe we need to continue to dive into the way that the church needs to be a wounded and rejected thing, wandering around in the world. And as the great image goes, we're beggars showing the other beggars where we've found bread.
You can find Father Tim Grumbach on our website, radiotrending.com. Underneath the guests page, you can listen to dozens upon dozens of episodes where Father Tim joins us, along with his social media on Facebook and Instagram at Father Tim Grumbach. If you enjoyed the show, please send me a message under the contact page. We would love to hear from you, including questions you might have, whether it's for Father Tim Grumbach or for our upcoming licensed marriage and family therapist. Send us your questions. Have a great week.
This has been Trending with Timmerie. To book her to speak or learn more about her guests, visit radiotrending.com. You can listen to more of Trending via the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or the iHeartRadio app, where you can share your favorite episodes.